Good day to everyone. My name is Lebohang Matibela. It is my pleasure to welcome you at the Northwest University's Joint Gender and Language Awareness Week in 2020. As part of the transformation agenda of the university, the NWU hosts annual awareness weeks to create opportunities for inclusive conversations to explore current issues concerning race, gender, and language. Due to COVID-19 situation, we are hosting an online awareness week in 2020 that focuses on gender and language, and it is my pleasure to welcome you in the NWU home and the homes of our presenters. We want to thank our presenters up front. They shared their expertise with us by making homemade videos for their studies, from their studies and from their living rooms. We appreciate their willingness to share their expertise with us under less than ideal circumstances, and we adore the authenticity of their views, underscored by the very personal touch of the handmade quality of the videos. The topics that our presenters tackled and that we will discuss are hard-hitting. Our aim in 2020 was to trouble our past and to reimagine our future. Our focus this year is the current state of gender-based violence and the ongoing complex conversations about multilingualism in South Africa. Some of the contributions are unsettling and very controversial. As a higher education institution, it is our duty to create opportunities where these difficult and sometimes painful conversations can take place in a safe space. The audience will be able to contribute to the conversation after the presentations. We encourage multilingual contributions. A translator would monitor the chat and the Q&A functions and assist with translations where necessary. I want to make a plea to members of the audience who are, you are also invited to assist with the translations if you are able to do so. In this way, we will be helping each other. We request that all comments and replies be respectful as is fitting of conversations at a higher education institution. The contributions would be via the chat and the Q&A functions and will be in writing. We request that comments are concise and relevant to the topic at hand. We look forward to the engagement of the audience after the presentations. Now, ladies and gentlemen, some technical issues. Once you are logged in, you will see a small green button on the right-hand side of your screen. You click on this, you will see the chat facility. We would love to hear your comments and would love for you to keep the momentum going by putting your comments in the chat. Should you have any questions related to any of our speakers or presentations, please put your questions in the Q&A. Some presenters will be present during the sessions and some not. You must remember we have guests from all over the world. Some would be sleeping in their countries because it would be midnight. If you have any questions to the presenters who could not join us, we will send your questions to them via email after the session. You will also be able to upvote someone else's question to move that question up to the top. The hosts and coordinators would keep an eye on the prominent questions and respond to them. In order to make use of all the awesome features that this visual platform has to offer, we recommend that you use your laptop. If you have logged on with your mobile phone or tablet, you may not experience all these features, but don't worry. There is time to log on with your laptop in addition to that. We will share our recordings after the event. For optimal viewing, we would like to suggest that you click on the full screen arrows, which is located in the top right-hand corner. This will expand your view. Should you experience a drop in your connectivity, again, don't panic. This does happen. Just simply refresh your browser and you will be automatically logged back in. Welcome to the NW's Joint Gender and Language Awareness Week. Please sit back and enjoy the sessions with us.
Good morning. The question we are looking at this morning is, how can intersectionality or an intersectional analysis give us a better understanding of identity and power relations in what we call the matrix of domination? I want to take a step back and look at the history of why there was a need for intersectional analysis in feminist theory. The first wave of feminist theory was committed to find solutions for women's political exclusion. So it was mainly focused on political rights. The second wave that started in the 1970s and 80s was more concerned with conditions of inequality that leads to the inequality of women, such as social and economic exclusions. So the second wave feminism looked at women's bodies, the fact that women can reproduce, in other words, reproductive rights. It looked at women's objectification that leads to violence, and it looks at conditions of violence and how that excludes women from being equal citizens with men. The problem with the second wave was that they looked at women as a homogeneous group. So there was the assumption that all women experience conditions of inequality in the same way. And they were more concerned with difference with men, whereas the first wave was concerned with the sameness with men. But in the pursuit of difference with men, they actually were very essentialist in the way they looked at women. And what happened was that the model that was used for exclusion was the experience of white women, and very often white middle-class women, which meant that there was an erasure of the experience of women of color, and specifically the experiences of poor women. And that led to a critique of second wave feminism that's also called radical feminism. And I want you to understand that radical feminism is not radical in the sense that it's militant, but it's called radical because of the solutions that were pursued by second wave feminists. Those solutions were the eradication of patriarchy and power relations between men and women. So that made them radical in the eyes of mainstream political science and feminist theory. Militant, of course, is something else. It means that there is direct action, protest, and so on, which the radicals also did. But it was the radicalism is connected to the solutions that they thought was necessary. So Black women and Black feminists, and specifically African American women, then did a critique of the essentialism of second wave feminists. And what they said is that unless you understand the intersectionalities of identities, and here the work of Chanda Mohanty and specifically Kimberly Crenshaw, who was the first person to write or to use the concept of intersectionality, is important. What Crenshaw said is that if you look at the exclusions of African American women from legal solutions, then we can see that it's got to do with the fact that they are Black and that they are women. And she coined this concept of intersectionality. She said, for example, that if you stand in an intersection on a street and you're hit by two cars coming from different directions, you are not going to know which one caused the worst damage or killed you. So this notion of intersectionality then refers to how we are located in terms of our identities in different ways. For example, I am a highly educated, middle-class white women. If you compare my conditions with poor, rural, illiterate women, there is really no comparison in terms of how we experience our conditions of domination or oppression. Somebody who is in the rural areas may, for example, be excluded from education. They may be poor, and they are women. My oppression, for example, may have to do with unequal pay or with male-dominated institutional cultures. And those things are very different. So intersectionality is used to give us an understanding of how we are located in society because of our different identities. But this cannot only be linked to identities, because then we're going to get bogged down in the quagmire of identity politics. So we have to understand that identities are also related to relations of domination in a matrix of domination. And that matrix of domination refers to exactly how we are located in relation to each other and in relation to men. So again, if we look at, for example, the position of white women in South Africa, very often white women are also oppressors because they may oppress their black domestic workers and so on. So we need to think of both identity and relations, power relations and relations of oppression. And one of the most important books that's recently come out on the issue of intersectionality is the book of Vivienne May called Pursuing Intersectionality, Unsettling Dominant Imaginaries. And I'm going to read a quote from her book to give us a better understanding of intersectionality. Intersectionality highlights how lived identity, structural systems, sites of marginalization, forms of power, and modes of resistance intersect in dynamic and shifting ways. The important implications of matrix thinking is that it prevents the add and stir approach, often used to add one or more identity group to existing epistemological approaches, political strategies, or research methodologies, so that we can account for relationships of power and how they impact people. Intersectionality centers power in a multi-pronged way as shifting across different sites and scales at the same time. It is not neutral, but evolved out of histories of struggle that pursued multiple dimensional forms of justice. End quote. Now, what this is saying is very important, because if we go back to the start of the use of intersectionality as a form of analysis, people started to think that you do intersectionality when you count up or count together all the different forms of oppression. So, for example, if you're a black, poor, working class, disabled women, you are more oppressed than somebody else. And that became known as the add and stir approach. So you add the identities together and then you get some idea of oppression. Now that is just plain wrong, because we cannot actually quantify oppression. And we very often hear this analysis in the South African context, where somebody would say, but under apartheid, black people were more oppressed than, for example, colored people. And that is not the way to think about intersection and intersectional analysis. What we are saying is that we also call that thinking the Olympics of oppression. So we try to see who's the most oppressed. And that's not a helpful or a productive way of doing an analysis. So let me then shift to the 2015 and 2016 Fallist movement, where students, women students, actually embraced the label of radical African intersectional feminists. So they were both radical, they drew on intersectionality, they were African, and they were feminists, and they are still the combination of those. But this is very important because it was the first time in the history of South Africa that we had young black women embracing the label of feminist, but also embracing radicalism and intersectionality. And so what we need to understand about their participation in, for example, hashtag end rape culture that happened during that time, and that was their resistance to sexual violence and sexual harassment, that they actually used an intersectional analysis to point out how African women are actually situated in positions where they are more exposed to gender-based violence than some of their peers who may be white, and just have more protection in terms of the structure. So here we talk about structural inequality and institutional cultures. Institutional cultures embeds relationships of power. And very often people who come from outside that institutional culture and are different from the dominant voices and people in that culture are excluded, marginalized, and do not feel that they belong there. And this was exactly the issue that the Fallist raised by saying that these institutional cultures make us feel unwelcome. The culture is hostile towards us, and it situates us differently from white students. And that, again, is the intersectional analysis you see, looking at the institutional culture through a lens of gender and of race and of class. So this intersectional analysis is very important to make us understand how people are positioned. And I really think that we cannot do feminist theory now in the 21st century without an intersectional lens. And what becomes very important now is also the issue of sexual orientation or sexuality. So LGBTIQ and specifically transgender has become very important and has raised a lot of consciousness during 2015 and 2016 about the exclusion and the marginalization of people who have different sexual identities. And we also see that now there is a much greater consciousness about people who are transgender, which means that they are not conforming to a heterosexual script, and they are not identifying as heterosexual. They may not identify as gay. So their identities are fluid. And in the past, we did not even think about that and how to incorporate that into our analysis. But we see that was very important in the period of 2015-16 with the Fallist students. So I'm ending this video now, and then we're going to start looking at some of the critiques against intersectionality. So now I'm going to talk about the critique against intersectional analysis or intersectional feminism. And I think I've already pointed out to this notion of add women and stir, which is a discredited notion. But then there's also this idea that, because I've said one can't really do feminist theory without an intersectional lens, that white feminists have started to say, but this is black feminism recycled. And they don't give any credit to the origins of intersectional feminism, and that it was a critique against the essentialism of white feminism or white liberal feminism. I want to quote some of the work of Sima Bilger, who is Canadian but has written extensively and with great insight about intersectional feminism. And she says, the depoliticization of intersectionality, despite its international growth and use, has occurred. While it was supposed to create counter-hegemonic and transformative knowledge, this purpose had been undermined through processes of what she calls the whitening of intersectionality, or calling intersectionality the brainchild of feminism, erasing the contribution of black feminists in whose writing the concept has its origins, leading to a silencing, exclusions, and misinterpretation of subordinate groups. Intersectionality is hailed and failed at the same time when white feminists start to argue that intersectionality has run its course, and to argue that, or it needs to be adjusted. She calls this move ornamental intersectionality that contributes to the neutralization of radical politics and social justice, a consequence of the way in which neoliberal capitalism appropriates concepts and marketizes them in the name of diversity and identity politics. And maybe let me say something about identity politics. So identity politics can be negative, but it can also be positive. When it's negative, is one identity gets singled out as the cause of a lot of oppression. And we've seen, and I think one of the criticism that has been raised against the Fallist movement is the notion of black pain. So there was the argument that, nobody can understand the oppression of black students because they cannot understand black pain. And that sort of then led to a type of identity politics around the notion of pain. But we have to understand that all concepts or all ideas are mediated through concepts. So pain as a concept needs to be analyzed and to be thought through and to situated in context of, in this case, I would say in the South African context of settler colonialism. So that becomes very important. But we can also have, and I will come back to that point, but there's also the issue then of how do we use identity politics in a positive way? And here I want to say, when you have, for example, we've made the argument in South Africa in terms of affirmative action that because people have been excluded in the past, so there's a disadvantage of the past and people have been excluded, there needs to be some action taken to remedy that exclusion. And let me explain it in this way. If you have an Olympic athlete and you have a local athlete and you make them compete against each other, the Olympic athlete will win every time because that is in the nature of his or her training and the fact that they're an Olympic athlete, which means you cannot put people who has a disadvantage on the same starting line and then expect them to run a race that will have a just and fair outcome for both of them. This is what we call structural barriers, and we also can see that in terms of the fact that we needed to take into consideration disadvantage. And in the South African case, there's disadvantage on grounds of race and gender and sexuality. So the idea of liberalism in liberal democracy says that we're all equal, we're all the same, and we have equal opportunities, and we just need to take those opportunities and we can run the same race. And that is actually fallacious thinking, because we can see that unless you deal with disadvantage, you will not have fair and just outcomes. So let me then say something about this notion of settler colonialism and how that has positioned people who've been part of the colonial system, but as the colonizers, but also the people who were colonized. And I want to just read something by the feminist theorist The Moon. She says, settler colonialism is not a meta-structure. It becomes a system that is deemed to determine all other relationships and ideas, including its culture, institutions, rituals, and governing structures, such that formations of capitalism, imperialism, sexuality, and patriarchy are seen as derivative of this meta-structure, rather than co-constituted and varied in its operation and effects. Again, people will be differently affected by that. So if we go back to the Fallist and we ask the question, how did the identities of gender, race, and class express themselves in the Fallist campaigns, we see that, first of all, there was the issue of race, that white and black students were very differently positioned. And we also saw that many white students were not prepared to participate in the campaigns of black students. Secondly, class. There was the issue of the missing middle, right? So there are students whose parents are too poor to get a loan, but they're also too rich to get a grant, or they earn too much for students to get a grant. So that missing middle had to do with class. And the other issue where class featured was the fact that students also incorporated janitors and the outsourcing of support staff into their campaigns. When janitors and support staff were outsourced, they lost all their benefits, their pensions, their medical aids, all of that. So they were discriminated against, and they incorporated those campaigns into their own campaign. And then, of course, gender became an issue after a woman student was raped by one of the other fallers, a male fallist, and it led to the RU reference list at Rhodes University, where 11 men were outed as alleged rapists. That then caused such an uproar that it spread to all the campuses around South Africa and started the hashtag End Rape Culture movement, where women actually campaigned to end rape culture and to end rape with impunity. And there was also the issue of performative intersectionality in those campaigns, where women took off their tops, and many of them campaigned and protested without their tops or without, with bare breasts. So they were actually, what they were saying with that symbolism is that women should not be objectified, and they reclaiming their bodies. So if you sexualize that naked body, it's about what's in your head. It's not about what the women are doing or what their bodies are actually used for or thought that should be used for. So they were saying that they're reclaiming their bodies in the face of rape impunity. So there we see race, class, and gender. And we also saw the trans students, transgender students who had at the University of Cape Town a protest about artwork on transgender people. And they actually took off their clothes and they lied naked in the art gallery at UCT. So that's performative intersectionality. And we can also call it the politics of spectacle, because it really was a spectacle and people did come to look at what the students were doing. So it highlighted the issue of gender. It highlighted the issue of sexuality and sexual orientation. So these things are very connected. The relationships of power in institutional cultures, but also the relationships of power between men and women, and the relationships of power between people who are heterosexual and those who are not non-conformative in terms of their sexual identity. In the last few minutes, I want to focus on issues of solidarity where intersectional politics is concerned. If we focus on one identity to the exclusion of others, then we are not really practicing intersectional politics, and that makes solidarity very difficult. So I think that one of the issues we saw during the Fallers campaigns were the reluctance of white students to participate in the politics or the campaigns of the Fallers students. And here we have to ask the question, is it because they could not relate to the issues or that they feel excluded? Or to what extent were they prepared, regardless of the fact that these issues did not really impact on them to the same extent that they impact on Black students for the sake of solidarity? So, and I don't have an answer to that question, because I think that solidarity is really important. We cannot really in South Africa have a situation where you have polarization around race or around gender or around sexuality. So whether it's our issues that we feel strongly about, or it's the issues of another group that really need some serious policy intervention, there need to be some level of solidarity. And we saw that solidarity in the hashtag End Rape Culture campaigns, where white women also took off their tops and marched in the hashtag End Rape Culture protests. And that is important because no race group is exempt from gender-based violence, and neither are people of the LGBTIQ trans community. So that solidarity is really very necessary. I think that, when we start to sort of think about how do we create solidarity, then we need to ask all kinds of questions about how do we understand our own positionality. And I want to just talk about depoliticization, because I very often think that once we put issues out there and we start to think about their intersectional aspects, they become depoliticized because the argument is, okay, let's make a policy around sexual harassment on the campus. And then it becomes, again, the experience of the majority of people. Their experience becomes the model of the experience that we want to address through policy. So policies very often depoliticize activism, and it depoliticize the issues around which we need to have solidarity. So let me say something about how do we understand non-oppressive coalitions. And I want to mention something about slut walks. If you haven't actually looked at slut walks, you can Google and just type in slut walks, and you'll see slut walks come up, because this is a global phenomenon, and it started in Canada after a police man said to women students that if you didn't dress like sluts, you wouldn't get raped. Now, that is what we call a rape myth, in the sense that, the first thing that's when a woman gets raped often is asked, what were you wearing? Why were you drinking? Why were you out late last night? Questions like that. So that reinforces the idea of women are to blame for sexual violence. So what we see with slut walks are women then who dressed up, in scantily dressed up in short dresses or out in their bras and so on, having protest marches against this type of blaming the victim and the sort of the attitude of police towards rape victims. And it became a global phenomenon in many different countries. In South Africa, we also had slut walks. But the critique against slut walks, again, is that if we look at how Black women are positioned, and here I'm talking specifically about Black women in America and Canada, they are a minority group. Their experience very often is one of being ignored by the police, or being blamed by the police, or being called sluts in general. So there's a narrative around Black women that's very different from the narrative around white women. And if we look at slut walks, then it foregrounds the experience of white women. So Black women have said that slut walks are exclusionary and marginalizes the experience of Black women. So then how do we think about non-oppressive coalitions? Caution should be taken not to essentialize the identities that can lead to certain dimensions of intersectionality. Sometimes race, sometimes gender, disappearing from view, something that intersectional analysis and theory have tried to work against. Identities have to be connected to a liberating praxis in order to move us beyond identity politics. Now, praxis means that you will act on your beliefs, and you will act in a way that you also give exposure to other people's experience. Levine Ratsky, who is also a feminist theorist, argued that multiple fragmented and shifting identities signify the contradictory positions of oppression and domination within it. There are rarely pure victims and pure oppressors. She suggests that using economic, political, or other types of relations are better than using identities that reify difference itself, because identities are formed through social relations. These relations will speak to structural conditions of oppression, which theories of Nancy Fraser, also a feminist theorist, address when she shows how recognition of stigmatized identities has economic redistributional consequences. She calls this a bivalent status model. Now, let me explain that. If you organize, and often we see people organize around identities, like we've seen in the Flawless movement, but also in the LGBTIQ movement. And that's why, for example, lesbians wanted marriage to be legalized, gay marriages to be legalized, because they are excluded from certain benefits that their partner will have if they're not married, such as medical coverage, pension, and all of that. And that's why we legalized gay marriages through the Civil Unions Act. Now, that tells us that not only did we have to recognize the gay identity, but we also had to recognize that there were redistributional problems, and that was the redistribution in economic terms. So very often it's redistribution and recognition that goes hand in hand. And that means that solidarities will also have to be formed not only around identities, but also around economic impacts of exclusion and marginalization. So for me to summarize, we have to think of intersectionality in relation to how identities are constructed, but also in terms of the economic impacts of exclusion and marginalization, and how it positions us in terms of the relations of power in what we can call a matrix of domination. Thank you.
Good day, my name is Nate. I am a second-year law student at the Noordwes-Universiteit. In this video recording, I will be responding and building on the presentation done by Prof. Gous on the articulations of identity as intersectional and the interlocking relation of dominance. Looking at this question and this brilliant work done by Prof. Gous in her presentation, I want to point our attention to the work of the philosopher Marilyn Fryer. Marilyn Fryer, in her body of work, uses an image of a bird cage to illustrate the oppression as a network of systematically related barriers that restrict and reduce the lives of women. This illustration can be helpful in understanding the interlocking oppression that minority groups face. Even so, it is still limiting. The reality can be seen when the barriers of gender, race, class, ethnicity, age, sexual orientation, ability, and religion intersect in the lives of women, thereby establishing and organizing social relations of domination in which each oppressive system depends on and shapes all others. This can be understood through an intersectional lens that certain individuals face multiple and intersecting forms of structural discrimination. I wish to point out that here we can see how Prof. Gous actually stated this clearly and eloquently in the Roads Must Fall movement, where the UCT trans collectives come out as part of the Roads Must Fall movement and actually reminded that their fellow peers that they themselves, as the trans collectives, face multiple intersecting forms of structural discrimination. In another field of expertise, the Center for Applied Legal Studies, which is a civil society organization and a law clinic based at Wits University, connects the worlds of academia and social justice. They do so by using a combination of research, advocacy, and litigation to support community struggles for social justice. Recognizing that the right violations do not occur in isolation, this organization adopts an intersectional approach that focuses on basic services, human rights, environmental justice, gender studies, and the rule of law. This drives me to my first question. Do you think that academia plays an active participative role in the public sector, in increasing public knowledge, in different movements, and how so does academia play a role? Can it be more impactful? Can it be more useful? This is the question I pose to you as a way for us to look at Possible means that we cannot only be textbook-based feminists or theoretically based in our different domains, in our different fields, but actually use our fields of interest, our power, our knowledge, and our information to impact real, sustainable change, structurally or in institutional development. By becoming critical and analyzing the intersectedness of religion, politics, gender, race, sexual orientation, and the broader ways that our South African political atmosphere currently faces and needs to address multiple crises. I believe by so doing, we can really help in the movement that feminism seeks to fight for, seeks to represent, and seeks to gain justice for. I'm of the view that an intersectional lens and intersectionality can be used and must be used in creating the kind of justice system which uses an intersectionality and reproductive justice framework for law reform. I mean, what kind of justice do we really have in our country where gender-based violence is of an ultimate high and on a rise and on a rise and on a rise, but the action and adjusting and working with our government institutions and our different bodies are just not helping or being useful in any means? I know we all have seen our fair share of Am I Next movement, the hashtags Am I Next, not so long ago, the hashtag Not in My Name, the movement, the national strikes. These are the kind of impacts and these are the kind of needs that scream out in the need of intersectional analysis, intersectional approach, and multisectoral work. Leading me to my second question, which is, what do you think our current political atmosphere can really do with willpower or with the needed resources at their exposure to impact social justice and social change? Do you think our government, our institutions can do so? I would really like to hear your thoughts and your input on this question, on this platform, and in our different means that we do every single day. In conclusion, I would like to point out that the importance stated by Prof. Hose that intersectionality really encourages cross-community, cross-sector, and cross-issue collaboration. Investing equally in each other's issues, narrative goals, and political agendas is a means that I feel we, within the academia, within different spaces, within the sector of civil society, within the private sector at large, can really use activists, lawyers, artists, scholars, cultural workers, and strategists to come together, working collaboratively alongside those directly impacted to achieve or at least attempt some sustainable change in the context of our feminist movement in modern South Africa. Thank you, and I look forward to your answer and our fruitful engagement.